We all need to make smart decisions with our money. The Long-Term Investor Podcast shows you how by distilling complex financial matters into easily digestible lessons. And now, here's your host, Chief Investment Officer at PlanCorp and the author of Making Money Simple, Peter Lazaroff.
One of the big news stories for markets recently has been when and how Congress would agree on an extension or suspension of the nation's debt ceiling. Fortunately, a short-term agreement was reached on October 7th that raises the U.S. borrowing limit into December and temporarily avoids a situation where our country defaults on its debt. But the agreement is such that we can expect another showdown in just a few months. In today's episode, I want to explain the history and purpose of the debt ceiling while also taking a look at the country's overall debt burden and what it means for investors. So let's get right to it. The debt ceiling was instituted in 1917 to provide more flexibility to finance the United States' involvement in World War I. Prior to the debt ceiling, Congress directly authorized each individual debt issued. Can you imagine if today's Congress had to approve every single Treasury bond issuance? Treasury securities are offered multiple times a week, so naturally it would be a nightmare to keep our government funded. Anyways, the Second Liberty Bond Act of 1917 removed the need for the individual approval of each bond issued, but it also introduced limits to the total amount that the United States government could borrow to meet its existing legal obligations. So that's all the debt ceiling is. It's the total amount of money that the United States government is authorized to borrow to meet its existing legal obligations. Those obligations include paying interest on the national debt, Social Security and Medicare benefits, military salaries, tax refunds, and other payments for the continuation of public goods and services. The debt ceiling is different than the budget, which Congress passes every year, that includes spending on some of the items I've just mentioned, as well as many others. Congress also taxes people to pay for all that spending. And in years where the government spends more than it takes in from taxes and other revenue, it increases the federal deficit. So the government needs to borrow money to continue paying what Congress has already okayed. To re-emphasize the point, the debt ceiling does not have anything to do with authorizing new spending commitments. That's the budget. The debt limit simply allows the government to finance legal obligations that Congresses and presidents of both parties have made in the past. So today, there are currently two massive bills in Congress that's being considered. One is a bipartisan infrastructure package that includes more than $1 trillion in spending on things like roads, bridges, rail, public transit, the electrical grid, broadband expansion, and more. And this has been approved by Senate and is poised for approval in the House. The second is a more complicated $3.5 trillion bill that focuses on expanding Medicare, addresses climate change, and boosts social programs. That bill, which includes both corporate and individual tax increases, sounds like it's going to have to be downsized to win the support of moderates in the Senate. Now, these spending bills are separate from the debt ceiling, but the debt ceiling has recently been getting tangled in negotiations because it's a source of leverage, and even the tiniest shred of uncertainty about the country paying its legal obligations has seemingly contributed to recent market volatility. And that's not unusual. Previous debt ceiling battles have also sparked market volatility whenever there's been any uncertainty about how and when Congress will act. While anxiety is increasing as the two political parties are digging in, it's also true that Congress has never failed to raise the debt ceiling before the country goes into default. Since 1960, Congress has acted 78 times to permanently raise, temporarily extend, or revise the definition of the debt limit. 49 times that happened under a Republican president, and 29 times under a Democratic president. I mentioned the presidential history there just as a reminder that our country's borrowing is funding decisions that were made from prior presidents and members of Congress, not just the decisions by those currently holding office. And I think that's a really important piece of information that often gets twisted and misrepresented to the public. Nowadays, voting to increase the debt limit has become politically difficult, mostly because it's seen as a vote for more spending that can be used in campaign ads against them. But make no mistake, Congress knows that the real-world effects of not being able to pay its bills would be catastrophic, and that's why they've never failed to raise the debt ceiling, regardless of the president or party makeup in Congress. An actual default would seemingly create chaos in global financial markets, since both domestic and international markets depend on the relative economic and political stability of U.S. debt instruments and the U.S. economy. The United States defaulting on its credit is uncharted territory, so I don't want to go down the full draconian chain of events that might occur in such a scenario, just because it's extremely unlikely we'd reach that point, since Congress seems well aware of the economic shocks and that they would be unprecedented. But even the perceived threat of a default on our debt has serious implications. The Government Accountability Office estimated that in 2011's debt ceiling standoff, it raised the borrowing costs by a total of $1.3 billion in fiscal year 2011. So what does the debt ceiling mean for investors? I think it means that in the near term, volatility should be expected. And because it's expected, there's really no reason to panic. We can't reasonably predict how this all plays out, nor can we predict how the overall market will react to the outcomes. Thinking back to that 2011 standoff, where it was starting to look like Congress wouldn't reach an agreement, the S&P 500 dropped nearly 20%, and if I remember correctly, the rebound started right when Standard & Poor's downgraded our country's debt, which is the type of headline you might look at and think things are really about to get out of control. This 2011 debt ceiling standoff is a great example of the difficulty in not only predicting the outcome of future events, but also in predicting how the market will react to those outcomes. If you go back just a few episodes and listen to episode 14, How Markets Work, I think this episode provides a lot of perspective on how unlikely you'd be in a better position from any change you might make to your portfolio due to the nation's debt ceiling or our growing debt. I think in general, you'd see you're probably just better off staying the course with your long-term plan. And with the debt ceiling debates likely to surface again in a few months, the long-term investor should continue to adhere to a strategy that accepts that markets are volatile and that downturns are unpredictable. So it's better to focus on what you can control and stay the course with your long-term plan. Now that we have a handle on the debt ceiling and what it means for investors, I want to turn my attention to our national debt as a whole. And this topic could easily be an episode of its own, and maybe it will be in the future. But I do think since we're talking about the country's debt, it's worth sharing a few quick thoughts on the $28 trillion in debt our country has outstanding. In my experience, working with a very wide spectrum of people across the country with a really diverse set of backgrounds, I find that people making the most noise about our country's debt either don't entirely understand it or have a political axe to grind. And those who know me well know I don't really like politics, but I do like economics. So I'm going to give you the economics on what's going on with our nation's debt. If you can go all the way back to 1776, we've always been in debt. There was this one real short period in 1835 where we briefly repaid the debt, but then the U.S. economy slipped into a depression in 1837. So we quickly went right back into debt. But beyond that short window, the national debt's been steadily growing as the needs of U.S. citizens have grown over time. In a credit-based monetary system such as ours, the U.S. debt level is going to expand and contract, but it will generally expand as the economy grows and as our nation's balance sheet grows. And I mention our nation's balance sheet for a very important reason. Every balance sheet has two sides, assets and liabilities. If we only talk about the country's $28 trillion liability, then we're leaving out a giant piece of relevant information. Consider for a moment that the federal government also owns about 28% of all land in the United States. The last estimate for value on this land was in an April 2015 paper from the Bureau of Economic Analysis that I can link to in the show notes, and it estimates the total land value is about $23 trillion. Now, chances are this land has probably appreciated in value since that paper in April 2015. And there's also a data point in this report that I found particularly interesting. It's that only 5.8% of the land owned by the United States is developed, but that developed land accounts for 50.7% of the total estimated value. So there's a lot of potential here. Meanwhile, the Institute for Energy Research estimates that the total fossil fuel resources owned by the federal government are valued at over $150 trillion. Now, I'll admit, there's some flaws in these calculations, but I think you get the picture. The U.S. balance sheet has some major assets that people don't always talk about. And we haven't even mentioned that the United States also has the ability to tax the most productive private sector in the world. So when you take that taxing ability along with the assets of, let's make up a lower number. Let's say it's $100 trillion in assets. Would you still say that the $28 trillion in debt is a problem? I also want to point out that the cost of our country's debt as a percentage of economic growth is actually declining. As a share of the economy, net interest costs are going to decline to 1.2% of GDP in fiscal year 2022 and remain at that level through 2025 before rising only to 2.6% of GDP by 2031. And I can link to a source in the show notes for all that. And look, I'm not trying to make a case that our current national debt levels are good or bad. I'm just trying to put things in perspective because I've watched countless investors want to make changes to their portfolio or buy specific investments using the current national debt levels as their investment thesis. Now, one thing that seems to be true about our existing debt is that there's some pretty compelling research showing that when government debt exceeds the amount of economic growth as the United States has, that an economy is going to grow more slowly. But I must remind you that the economy is not the stock market. The correlation between GDP and stock market returns is basically zero, meaning they aren't related. Companies, they're global. They're going to go wherever the profits will be. So in the end, national debt isn't necessarily good or bad. It really just depends on what that debt is being used for. Is it making a positive or negative contribution to our lives? Is it contributing to high inflation? And not just 3% high, that's actually quite average, but persistently high single-digit or low double-digit inflation. You see, the government could very well spend money inefficiently or misallocate resources in such a way that there'd be a reasonable argument that the government is too big and can be reduced in size. Are we at that point today? I honestly have no idea, but we aren't remotely at a place that the long-term investor should be worrying about. For show notes, resources, and a place to submit questions, please visit thelongterminvestor.com. And if you're enjoying the show, consider sharing it with someone who also might benefit from listening. I'll be back next week, but until then, to long-term investing.
Thanks for listening to the Long-Term Investor Podcast. To access free financial resources and submit questions to be answered on the show, visit thelongterminvestor.com. Peter Lazaroff is an employee of PlanCorp and BrightPlan. All opinions expressed by Peter and any podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of PlanCorp or BrightPlan. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of PlanCorp and BrightPlan may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.